The cantina fell silent as Zethkaler limped through the entrance, his scarred carapace catching the dim light. Four arms hung at his sides, two of them synthetic replacements that gleamed with military precision. The Vakari veteran's compound eyes swept the room, cataloging threats out of habit before settling on an empty booth in the corner. He ordered his usual fermented Kellic juice, the closest thing to alcohol that wouldn't poison his system, and tried to ignore the whispers that followed him wherever he went. 20 years since the human wars ended, and still beings looked at him like he was a ghost. Maybe he was. The young Terran approached hesitantly, her recording device clutched in trembling hands. Zethkaler had seen her kind before, journalists, historians, beings who thought they understood war because they'd read about it in sanitized reports. This one was different, though. Her eyes held genuine curiosity, not the morbid fascination he usually encountered. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely audible above the cantina's ambient noise. "Are you Zethkaler?" The veteran. He gestured to the seat across from him with one of his natural arms. "Depends who's asking. I'm Sarah Chun, investigative journalist for the Galactic Tribune. I'm working on a piece about the human wars, and your name came up in several military archives. They say you served in all three major campaigns." Zethkaler's mandibles clicked, the Vakari equivalent of a bitter laugh. "Served? That's one way to put it." He took a long drink from his glass. "You humans have interesting ways of describing things. Makes them sound cleaner than they were." Sarah activated her recording device and placed it on the table. "Would you be willing to share your experiences? The galaxy deserves to know what really happened during those conflicts." The old warrior studied her for a long moment. So young, so naive. She probably thought war was about strategy and heroics the way the Holovids portrayed it. She had no idea what she was asking for. "You want to know about the human wars?" Zethkaler's voice carried the weight of decades. "Very well, but understand this. Once you hear what I have to say, you can't unhear it. The comfortable lies your species tells itself about those conflicts, they'll crumble." Sarah leaned forward, her recorder capturing every word. "I'm ready." Zethkaler's synthetic arm whirred softly as he reached for his drink again. "No," he said quietly, "you're not. None of us were." The first time Zethkaler encountered humans was during the Proxima Uprising, when he was young and foolish enough to believe that war had rules. The Galactic Council had dispatched a peacekeeping force to contain what they thought was a minor rebellion on a few Outer Rim worlds. Intelligence reports suggested the humans were using outdated weapons and basic tactics. The Council expected the conflict to last weeks, maybe a month at most. Zethkaler had been a squad leader then, commanding 12 of his finest warriors. The Vakari were respected throughout the galaxy for their military prowess. Their four arms allowed for complex weapon configurations, and their compound eyes gave them superior battlefield awareness. They had never lost a campaign. "We landed on Proxima, 7 expecting to face desperate colonists with farming equipment," Zethkaler continued, his voice growing distant. The initial reports were encouraging. Human settlements appeared abandoned, their defensive positions weak and poorly constructed. Sarah scribbled notes as she listened. What changed? Everything. The old veteran's eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the cantina walls. The first sign something was wrong came from Lieutenant Vexhai. His squad had advanced into what appeared to be an empty city. Standard urban pacification, check buildings, secure civilians, establish a forward base. Zethkaler paused, his synthetic fingers drumming against the table with mechanical precision. Vexhai was a good soldier. 30 years' experience, fought in the Andorian conflicts, the Centauri rebellion. He'd seen everything, or so we thought. The communication had been brief, confused. Vexhai's voice crackling through the static with words that made no sense at the time. "They're in the walls," he transmitted. "By the void, they're living in the walls." The humans had turned the entire settlement into a trap, Zethkaler explained. Not just defensive positions, but an entire underground network. They'd spent months, maybe years, preparing for our arrival. While we were patrolling empty streets, they were moving through tunnels beneath our feet, accessing every building through hidden passages. Sarah's pen had stopped moving. They knew you were coming? Oh, they knew more than that. They knew exactly how we would deploy, which routes we would take, which buildings we would consider strategically important. Every piece of intelligence we thought we had was carefully crafted misinformation. The attack, when it came, defied everything the Galactic Council understood about human capabilities. Zeth Kaler's compound eyes had caught the first movement, a barely perceptible shift in what appeared to be solid wall. By the time he realized what he was seeing, the humans were already among them. They moved like shadows, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Our thermal sensors couldn't track them properly. They developed some kind of heat-dampening suit. Our motion detectors were useless because they knew exactly where the sensors were positioned. The humans didn't fight like the textbooks said they should. There were no formations, no clear command structure, no traditional tactics. Instead, they flowed through the battlefield like water, appearing where they shouldn't be possible, striking from angles that didn't exist. Sergeant Cree Thack was the first to die, Zeth Kaler recalled. A projectile through the head from a direction we'd already cleared. When we turned to locate the shooter, there was nothing there. Just empty air and the echo of gunfire. The human weapons were another shock. Intelligence had suggested they were using primitive kinetic projectiles, but what the Vicari encountered was far more sophisticated. The bullets, if they could be called that, seemed to change behavior mid-flight, curving around cover, fragmenting into multiple projectiles, or releasing unknown toxins on impact. We couldn't understand how they were doing it, Zeth Kaler said. Our armor was rated for military-grade plasma weapons, but these human projectiles cut through it like paper. Later, much later, we learned they'd been studying captured Galactic Council equipment for decades, developing specific countermeasures for every defensive system we used. Sarah finally looked up from her notes. How many of your squad survived? The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Zeth Kaler's synthetic arm stopped its rhythmic drumming. 3, he said finally. Out of 12, 3 made it to the extraction point. But survived isn't the right word. We were changed, broken in ways that don't show up on medical scanners. The worst part hadn't been the losses, though those were devastating. The worst part was the realization that everything they thought they knew about warfare was obsolete. The humans fought with a creativity and adaptability that bordered on madness. They used their environment in ways no other species had conceived of, turning civilian infrastructure into weapons, using their own wounded as bait, employing psychological tactics that attacked the very concept of military order. Private Yelnosh cracked first, Zeth Kaler continued. He started seeing humans everywhere, in shadows, in reflections, in empty spaces where no one could possibly be hiding. We thought it was combat stress, but later we realized he wasn't wrong. The humans had mastered the art of psychological warfare in ways we couldn't comprehend. The extraction had been a nightmare of running battles through streets that shifted and changed as the humans manipulated their environment. Buildings that had been empty became filled with snipers. Clear passages became kill zones. Safe zones became traps. When the dropship finally arrived, Zeth Kaler said, I thought we'd escaped. Then I saw the pilot's face through the cockpit window. He paused, his mandibles clicking softly. Terror. Absolute terror. And she was one of our best, flew combat missions in 3 different systems. The pilot had been watching the battle from above, using the ship's sensors to track the engagement. What she'd seen had shattered her understanding of what humans were capable of. The thermal imaging showed impossible movement patterns. The electromagnetic sensors detected weapons signatures that shouldn't have existed. The communication intercepts revealed human voices speaking in languages that didn't appear in any database, coordinating attacks with a precision that suggested hive mind intelligence. She kept saying the same thing over and over, Zeth Kaler recalled. They're not fighting like individuals. They're fighting like a single organism. Sarah had stopped taking notes entirely. Her face had gone pale, and she was staring at the old veteran with a mixture of fascination and horror. That was just the first engagement, Zeth said softly. The opening move of a conflict that would reshape how every species in the galaxy thought about warfare. And humans. He took another long drink from his glass. Humans were just getting started. The cantina around them seemed to have grown quieter, as if the other patrons sensed the weight of the conversation taking place in the corner booth. Zeth compound eyes swept the room again, a habit born from decades of hypervigilance. The council's response was predictable, he continued. They assumed the first battle was an anomaly, that the humans had gotten lucky or that our intelligence had been faulty. They sent in more troops, better equipped, with stricter rules of engagement. Sarah found her voice again. What happened? The humans adapted. Zeth synthetic arm word as he gestured. That's what you people don't understand about your own species. Every other race in the galaxy fights the same way their ancestors did, with minor technological improvements. Humans learn. And they learn fast. The second wave of council forces had included Zeth unit, now reinforced with the best soldiers from 6 different worlds. They'd studied the tactical reports from the first engagement, developed new equipment specifically designed to counter human strategies, and approached the conflict with the confidence of superior technology and training. We lasted 4 days, Zeth said simply. The humans had anticipated every countermeasure, every tactical adjustment, every technological advantage the council forces brought to bear. Worse, they developed new strategies specifically designed to exploit the overconfidence of their enemies. They let us think we were winning at first, the veteran explained. Small victories, successful advances, captured positions that seemed strategically important. We thought our new tactics were effective. Then, on the 4th day, we realized every victory had been given to us deliberately. The humans had used the council's successes against them, feeding false intelligence, allowing captures of seemingly important installations, letting the alien forces establish what appeared to be secure positions. All the while, they were studying their enemies' behavior, learning their patterns, identifying their weaknesses. When they struck back, Zeth said, it wasn't just an attack. It was a demonstration. They showed us that they had been in complete control of the battlefield from the very beginning. Sarah's recorder was still running, but she seemed to have forgotten about it entirely. How was that possible? Because humans don't think about war the way we do, Zeth replied. We see conflict as a competition between forces, tactics against tactics, technology against technology. Humans see it as a problem to be solved, and they're very, very good at solving problems. The old veteran fell silent for a moment, lost in memories that still haunted his sleep decades later. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible above the cantina's background noise. The 3rd campaign was when things really got interesting, he said. That's when the council decided to stop treating this as a peacekeeping operation and start treating it as a war. He looked directly at Sarah, his compound eyes reflecting the dim lighting in a way that made them seem almost luminescent. And that's when we learned that humans have been holding back. The Galactic Council's declaration of full military engagement changed everything. What had been a peacekeeping mission became an all-out war, with a combined might of 17 different species brought to bear against human-controlled worlds. Zeth found himself promoted to battalion commander, leading 300 of the galaxy's finest warriors into what the strategists called the final phase. We thought we understood the scope of human capabilities, Zeth said, his synthetic fingers tracing patterns on the table surface. The first 2 engagements had shown us they were more dangerous than initial estimates suggested, but Command believed that was the extent of their surprises. Full deployment would overwhelm any remaining resistance. Sarah had ordered another drink, though she'd barely touched her first one. The weight of the veteran's words seemed to press down on her like a physical force. How many troops did the council deploy? 2 million soldiers from the finest military units in the galaxy, Zeth replied without hesitation. The Centauri Death Legion, Andromedan Shield Bearers, Syrian Tactical Corps, my own Vakari Strike Force. We had orbital bombardment platforms, atmospheric processors, reality displacement weapons. enough firepower to crack a moon. The deployment had been massive, coordinated across 17 different star systems simultaneously. The strategy was simple: overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Human settlements will be given one chance to surrender before facing complete annihilation. The Council expected the war to last weeks. The humans let us deploy completely, Zeth continued. Every ship, every soldier, every piece of equipment. They watched us position our forces with what seemed like passive resignation. Our intelligence analysts interpreted this as acceptance of inevitable defeat. The first sign that something was wrong came from the communications array. Commander Veltar, the Andromedan overseeing battlefield communications, had noticed unusual electromagnetic signatures in areas where no human technology should have existed. When he reported this to command, the generals dismissed it as interference from their own equipment. Veltar was found dead in his command bunker 3 days later, Zeth said quietly. No signs of struggle, no wounds, no indication of how anyone could have gotten past security. Just dead. The medics said his nervous system had simply stopped functioning, as if someone had turned off a switch. That was when the real war began. The humans hadn't been passive during the deployment phase. They'd been studying. Every conversation over open channels, every tactical manual access through the battlefield network, every strategic discussion in supposedly secure facilities, all of it had been monitored, analyzed, and processed by human intelligence networks that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere. They knew our battle plans before we did, Zeth explained. Not just the overall strategy, but individual squad movements, supply line schedules, even personal communications between soldiers and their families back home. They'd infiltrated our information networks so completely that they had access to data we didn't know we were transmitting. The attacks began simultaneously across all 17 theaters of operation. But these weren't the guerrilla tactics from the previous engagements. This was something entirely different. Warfare conducted on levels the Council forces couldn't even perceive, let alone defend against. Lieutenant Kexhi's unit was the first to encounter what the humans called adaptive terrain, Zeth said. They were advancing through what appeared to be a standard forest environment when the ground beneath their feet began to change. Not shifting or moving, changing. Solid earth became quicksand, then crystallized into razor-sharp formations, then returned to normal soil. Sarah's pen had frozen midword. How is that possible? Nanotechnology, Zeth replied. Microscopic machines seeded throughout the environment, programmed to respond to specific triggers. The humans had spent years preparing these battlefields, literally reshaping matter at the molecular level. They could change the fundamental properties of anything we might use for cover, concealment, or movement. The forest engagement had lasted 14 hours. Kexhi's unit of 60 elite soldiers had been systematically eliminated not by enemy fire, but by their environment itself. Trees became weapons, releasing toxins or explosive pods. The air itself turned hostile, filled with nanoscale machines that interfered with alien respiratory systems. Even the lights seemed wrong, bending and shifting in ways that made accurate targeting impossible. When the rescue teams finally reached the area, Zeth continued, there were no bodies, no equipment, no trace that a battle had ever taken place. Just an empty forest that looked exactly as it had before the engagement began. But the environmental warfare was only one aspect of human capabilities. On the industrial world of Kepler, 442, Colonel Zrixtan's armored division encountered something that defied everything the galaxy understood about military technology. Zrixtan reported that his vehicles were being disabled by weapons that shouldn't have existed, Zeth said. Energy beams that passed through armor without damaging it, but somehow destroyed the electronics inside. Projectiles that phased through solid matter to strike targets that should have been protected. Explosives that worked backwards, pulling energy out of the environment instead of releasing it. The humans had weaponized physics itself. They discovered ways to manipulate fundamental forces that other species use for basic engineering and turn them into instruments of war. Gravity weapons that could crush armor from the inside out. Electromagnetic fields that could scramble alien nervous systems without affecting human biology. Temporal distortions that made cause and effect unreliable. The worst part wasn't the weapons themselves, Kaler explained. It was watching our soldiers lose their minds trying to fight enemies that operated by different rules of reality. When you fire a plasma bolt and it travels backward through time to hit you before you pull the trigger, conventional military thinking breaks down. Sarah had pushed her notepad aside and was staring at the old veteran with unconcealed horror. "You're talking about impossible things." "That's what I thought," Kaler replied. "What we all thought. But humans have a saying, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The problem was, we thought we were the advanced ones. The space battles have been even worse than the ground engagements." Admiral HFY Cole, commanding the Council's finest battle fleet, had reported enemy vessels that could disappear from sensors only to reappear inside his formation. Human ships that seemed to violate the laws of physics, accelerating without visible propulsion, changing direction without momentum transfer, surviving direct hits from weapons that should have vaporized them. HFY Cole was a veteran of 43 space battles, Kaler said. He'd commanded fleets against the Void Spawn, defeated the crystal entities at Rigel, broken the siege of Vega Prime. But after 3 days of fighting humans, he transmitted a single message to command. Request immediate extraction. Enemy is not operating within known parameters of reality. The human vessels weren't just technologically superior. They seemed to be operating under entirely different physical laws. They could exist in multiple locations simultaneously, phase in and out of various dimensions, and manipulate space-time in ways that made traditional naval tactics useless. When our ships fired at them, the weapons would sometimes hit targets that weren't there, sometimes miss targets that were directly in front of us, and sometimes hit our own vessels despite being aimed in completely different directions, Kaler continued. It was as if the humans had rewritten the rules of cause and effect. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the technology, it was the coordination. Every human action, from individual soldier movements to fleet-wide maneuvers, was perfectly synchronized across impossible distances. They moved as if controlled by a single consciousness that could process information and make decisions faster than any known computer system. "We started calling them the Swarm," Kaler said. "Not because they moved like insects, but because they seemed to share a collective intelligence. A human sniper on one world would adjust his tactics based on information gathered by a completely different unit in another star system. Their learning curve wasn't just fast, it was instantaneous and universal. The psychological impact on Council forces was devastating. Soldiers who had faced the most horrific enemies in the galaxy without flinching began to crack under the pressure of fighting an enemy that seemed to violate the basic principles of reality. Some refused to fight. Others turned their weapons on themselves rather than face another engagement. A few simply walked away from their positions and were never seen again. General Vorthek called for a strategic withdrawal on day 12, Kaler said. He lost 60% of his command, not to enemy action, but to psychological breakdown. The humans hadn't just defeated our forces. They'd made war itself impossible for us to comprehend. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. What happened to the withdrawal? Kaler's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter if it hadn't sounded so hollow. The humans wouldn't let us leave. Every ship that attempted to reach minimum safe distance for jump calculations was intercepted by vessels that appeared out of nowhere. They didn't destroy the ships. That would have been merciful. Instead, they disabled them and left the crews floating in space, watching their rescue attempts fail one by one. The siege lasted another 8 days. During that time, the humans demonstrated capabilities that went beyond advanced technology into realms that suggested they had fundamentally different relationships with the universe itself. They could manipulate time, space, matter, and energy in ways that broke every law of physics the Council had discovered. On day 20, Zeph Kaler said, "They finally let us go. Not because we had earned it, not because we had fought bravely or negotiated skillfully. They let us go because they had learned everything they wanted to know about us." The retreat had been orderly, almost ceremonious. Human vessels had appeared to escort Council ships to safe jump points, ensuring their departure was completed without incident. It was a display of mercy that was somehow more terrifying than any violence could have been. As we jumped to hyperspace, Zeph Kaler concluded, I realized the truth. This hadn't been a war at all. It had been an experiment. The humans had been testing us, measuring our capabilities, understanding our limitations. And we had failed every test. Sarah sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing what she'd heard. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse. How many Council soldiers made it home? 700,000, Zeph Kaler replied. Out of 2 million. But those numbers don't tell the real story. We brought back something worse than casualties. We brought back knowledge. The understanding that everything we thought we knew about warfare, about technology, about the nature of reality itself, was wrong. The old veteran finished his drink and gestured for another. And that was still only the beginning, because the humans, having completed their experiments, decided to show the galaxy what they were really capable of. The aftermath of what the Council officially designated as the third human engagement sent shockwaves throughout galactic civilization. 700,000 survivors returning with stories that sounded like fever dreams. Technologies that violated known physics. Enemy forces that seemed to exist outside conventional reality. The Galactic Council found itself facing a crisis that threatened the fundamental understanding of warfare itself. The debriefings lasted for months, Zeph Kaler said, his synthetic arm tapping out a rhythmic pattern against his glass. Teams of xenobiologists, military analysts, and physicists interviewed every survivor, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. They thought we were suffering from collective trauma, mass hallucinations brought on by combat stress. Sarah had finally managed to restart taking notes, though her handwriting was shaky. Did they believe you? Not at first, Zeph Kaler replied. How could they? We were describing enemy capabilities that challenged everything they knew about technology and physics. Weapons that worked backwards through time. Ships that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Soldiers who seemed to share a collective consciousness spanning light years. The official reports classified most survivor testimonies as combat-induced psychotic episodes. The Council's Science Division insisted that no species could develop technology so far beyond galactic standards without leaving detectable traces of their research and development processes. The evidence suggested that human technology should be centuries behind Council standards, not millennia ahead. Then, the monitoring stations started going dark, Zeph Kaler continued. The Council maintained surveillance networks around all human-controlled systems, automated platforms that collected data on ship movements, communications traffic, technological development. These stations were positioned at the edge of solar systems, hidden behind asteroids or gas giant moons, completely undetectable by any known scanning technology. The first station to cease transmission was Observation Post Gamma 7, monitoring the Wolf 359 system. Its final data burst showed normal human colony activity, agricultural settlements, basic mining operations, civilian transport vessels using conventional fusion drives. Then silence. Command assumed it was a mechanical failure, Zeph Kaler explained. These posts were designed to operate autonomously for decades. Single-point failures were supposed to be impossible. They dispatched a stealth reconnaissance ship to investigate. The reconnaissance vessel never returned. Its final transmission was a burst of encrypted data that took the Council's best cryptographers weeks to decode. When they finally broke the encryption, the message consisted of a single word repeated over and over everywhere. That's when stations started disappearing faster, Kaler said. Not just the ones monitoring human systems, but the deep space platforms positioned throughout Council space. Stations that were supposed to be so secret that their locations were known only to the highest levels of military command. Within 6 months, the Council had lost contact with over 300 monitoring stations spread across 17 sectors. The pattern suggested that someone was systematically hunting down surveillance platforms using detailed knowledge of their positions and capabilities. But the technology required to locate and disable these hidden installations would have been beyond even the most advanced Council military units. Admiral Kesvar led a task force to investigate the Wolf 359 system directly, Kaler continued. 12 heavy cruisers, the most advanced sensors in the fleet, enough firepower to sterilize a planet. They jumped in expecting to find evidence of human expansion or hidden military installations. What they found instead challenged every assumption about human capabilities and intentions. The colonies were exactly as the surveillance data had indicated: small agricultural settlements with populations in the thousands, basic infrastructure, no visible military presence. But the space around the system told a different story. Kesvar's sensors detected artificial structures throughout the system, Kaler said. Not ships or stations, but something else entirely. Geometric formations that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially somewhere else. They were visible to instruments, but cast no shadows, reflected no light, and seemed to phase in and out of reality. The human colonists, when contacted, seemed genuinely surprised by the arrival of Council forces. They welcomed the aliens cordially, offered to share agricultural data and trade goods, and showed no signs of hostility or advanced military technology. Their settlements were primitive by galactic standards, their technology centuries behind Council capabilities. But while Kesvar's officers were conducting diplomatic meetings on the surface, Kaler continued, his sensor teams were detecting impossible things in orbit. Energy readings that suggested the presence of massive industrial complexes, but visual confirmation showed empty space. Gravitational anomalies indicating structures with a mass of small moons, but nothing there to cast shadows on nearby objects. The investigation lasted 3 days. During that time, Council scientists documented over 2,000 separate anomalies that defied explanation. Space that bent in directions that didn't exist. Energy sources that drew power from vacuum itself. Structures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. On the 4th day, Kaler said, the humans made contact. It hadn't been the colonial administrators or agricultural workers who initiated communication. Instead, a voice had spoken directly through the flagship's communication systems without using any detectable transmission method. The voice was calm, polite, and spoke perfect galactic standard despite humans supposedly having no access to linguistic databases. The message was simple, Kaler recalled. Thank you for visiting our system. We hope your stay has been educational. Please return safely to your homes and share what you have learned. That was when Admiral Kesvar realized they had been under observation from the moment they'd entered the system. Every scanner sweep, every landing party, every private conversation between officers had been monitored by an intelligence system so advanced it could penetrate Council military encryption in real time. The withdrawal was polite, Kaler said. No threats, no hostile actions, no attempts to prevent their departure. But as the task force prepared to jump to hyperspace, Kesvar's communication officer reported something that turned everyone's blood cold. The humans had been broadcasting detailed information about the Council task force to unknown recipients throughout the galaxy. Ship configurations, crew complements, weapon specifications, tactical doctrines. Everything had been analyzed, cataloged, and transmitted to destinations the Council couldn't track. We realized then that we hadn't been investigating them, Kaler said. They had been studying us. Every Council ship that had ever entered a human system, every monitoring station we'd positioned, every surveillance operation we'd conducted, All of it had been known, monitored, and used to gather intelligence about our capabilities. Sarah's notepad had been forgotten again. She was staring at the veteran with growing alarm. They knew about everything. More than that, Zeth Kaler replied. They had been allowing us to spy on them, feeding us carefully selected information while learning everything about our military capabilities. What we thought was secret surveillance had been an open exchange where only one side realized they were sharing data. The implications were staggering. Every strategic plan, every technological development, every military secret the Council possessed had potentially been compromised. The humans hadn't just been preparing for war. They had been studying their enemies for decades, possibly centuries, gathering information that would allow them to counter any conceivable Council strategy. But that still wasn't the worst revelation, Zeth Kaler continued. The worst part came when our xenobiologists analyzed the genetic samples collected during diplomatic meetings with human colonists. The analysis had revealed something impossible. The humans they'd encountered weren't using advanced technology to achieve their impossible capabilities. They were evolving. Their genetic structure was changing in real time, adapting to environmental pressures and strategic requirements at a rate that should have taken millions of years. Dr. Velthera, our best geneticist, spent months studying the data, Zeth Kaler said. What she found broke every law of evolutionary biology. Human DNA wasn't just changing, it was being rewritten with purpose and intelligence. They were directing their own evolution, becoming something new with each generation. The implications were terrifying. If humans could control their own evolution, they could develop biological capabilities specifically designed to counter any threat. They could become immune to any weapon, resistant to any environment, adapted for any form of warfare. The Council faced a choice, Zeth Kaler said. They could acknowledge that humans represented a fundamental threat to galactic civilization and attempt some kind of preemptive action, or they could hope that human intentions remained peaceful despite their growing capabilities. The debate raged for months. Some argued for immediate action, while human expansion was still contained to a few systems. Others insisted that attacking a species guilty only of being too advanced would make the Council no better than the aggressors they claimed to protect against. Then, the reports started coming in from the frontier sectors, Zeth Kaler said. Council ships were disappearing. Not destroyed in battle, not lost to accidents, simply vanishing without trace or explanation. Scout vessels, cargo haulers, even military patrols. They would enter a system and never emerge. The search parties sent to investigate these disappearances found something even more disturbing than wreckage or bodies. They found nothing at all. No debris fields, no energy signatures, no trace that the missing ships had ever existed. It was as if they had been erased from reality itself. Captain HFY was commanding a patrol squadron when they received a distress signal from the freight hauler Prosperity's Dream. Zeth Kaler continued. Standard merchant vessel carrying agricultural supplies to the Tau Ceti colonies. The signal was weak but clear, pirates attacking, requesting immediate assistance. HFY ships had responded immediately, jumping to the coordinates provided in the distress call. What they found was a perfectly normal star system with no sign of pirate activity, no trace of the missing freighter, and no indication that a distress signal had ever been transmitted. But while they were investigating, Zeth Kaler said, HFY's communication officer detected something impossible. They were receiving detailed telemetry from the Prosperity's Dream. Engine status, cargo manifest, crew vital signs. The ship was transmitting data as if it were operating normally, but their sensors showed nothing but empty space. The mystery deepened when HFY attempted to respond to the phantom transmissions. His communications were acknowledged. Conversations were held with crew members who insisted everything was normal, but no visual confirmation was possible. The missing ship seemed to exist in some parallel reality where it could communicate with the Council patrol, but couldn't be seen or detected. After 6 hours of this, Zeth Kaler continued, the transmission stopped. Complete silence. No final distress call, no indication of what had happened. The Prosperity's dream simply ceased to exist, along with its crew of 37 beings. Sarah finally found her voice again. What was happening to them? Zethkaler's compound eyes reflected the cantina's dim lighting as he considered the question. We didn't know then. It would be another year before we understood what the humans had become capable of. But looking back, I think we were witnessing the early stages of their expansion into dimensions of reality we couldn't perceive. The old veteran paused to order another drink, his synthetic arm moving with mechanical precision. When he continued, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on everything around them. The council finally decided to act, he said. Not because they understood what they were facing, but because the disappearances were threatening interstellar commerce and communication. They assembled the largest military force in galactic history and prepared to demand answers from humanity. Zethkaler looked directly at Sarah, his expression unreadable. That's when we learned that everything we'd experienced before, the impossible technologies, the reality-defying capabilities, the evolution beyond our understanding, had been humanity holding back. The Grand Fleet represented the pinnacle of galactic military might. 5 million soldiers from 43 different species, commanded by the greatest strategic minds in Council history. Ships so advanced they could crack continents, weapons that could boil atmospheres, shields that could withstand stellar radiation. It was the largest concentration of destructive power ever assembled in galactic history. They called it the final intervention, Zethkaler said, his voice hollow with memory. The plan was simple. Establish a blockade around all human systems, demand explanations for the disappearances, and negotiate terms that would contain human expansion until their capabilities could be properly assessed. Sarah had given up pretending to take notes. The magnitude of what she was hearing had moved beyond simple documentation into something that felt like witnessing the unraveling of everything she thought she understood about the universe. Who commanded the fleet? Supreme Admiral Vorthike, Zethkaler replied. Hero of the Andromedan Wars, architect of the Centauri victory, the finest military mind of his generation. If anyone could find a diplomatic solution to the human problem, it would be him. The fleet had deployed across 17 star systems simultaneously, taking positions that would allow them to monitor all human activity while maintaining enough distance to avoid any appearance of immediate hostility. The message transmitted to all human colonies was formal but respectful. The Galactic Council requested dialogue regarding recent unexplained phenomena in Council space. The human response was immediate, Zethkaler continued. Not from governments or military commands, but from individual humans throughout their territory. Farmers, miners, traders, children, all speaking in perfect unison, as if they shared a single voice. The message had been simple and terrifying in its implications. We appreciate your concern and understand your confusion. Please select representatives for a diplomatic meeting. We will provide suitable accommodation for your needs. Vorthike should have recognized the trap, Zethkaler said. No species communicates with perfect synchronization across light years of distance. No civilization allows children to speak for their government in first contact situations. But the Admiral was focused on his mission: establish dialogue, assess capabilities, negotiate containment. The humans had provided coordinates for a meeting in neutral space, exactly halfway between human and Council territories. The location was an empty system with no strategic value, no resources worth fighting over, nothing but dark matter and cosmic radiation. It seemed like the perfect place for diplomatic negotiations. Admiral Vorthike selected his finest diplomatic team, Zethkaler continued. 30 representatives from the major Council species, including myself as a military observer. We traveled to the coordinates in a single light cruiser, unarmed as a gesture of peaceful intent. What they found at the coordinates challenged every assumption about human technological capabilities. Instead of a diplomatic vessel or space station, There was a structure that shouldn't have been possible to construct, a perfect sphere approximately 100 kilometers in diameter, composed of materials that seemed to exist in a constant state of flux. The sphere wasn't solid, Zeth Kaler explained. Our sensors showed it was made of some kind of programmable matter that could shift between states at will. One moment it appeared to be crystalline, the next it flowed like liquid, then solidified into configurations that hurt to look at directly. The diplomatic team had been invited aboard through a docking port that formed itself out of the sphere's surface as they approached. The interior defied spatial logic. Corridors that led to rooms larger than the entire structure, chambers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, architecture that seemed to reshape itself based on the observer's expectations. The human representatives were waiting for us in what appeared to be a standard diplomatic conference room, Zeth Kaler said. They looked perfectly normal, the same genetic baseline we'd encountered in the colonies. But there was something wrong with the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they seemed to exist. Sarah leaned forward despite herself. What do you mean? They cast no shadows, Zeth Kaler replied. Not metaphorically, literally. Light passed through them as if they weren't entirely present in our dimension. When they spoke, their voices came from multiple directions simultaneously. When they gestured, their movements left brief afterimages in the air. The negotiations had been polite, professional, and absolutely terrifying. The human representatives acknowledged the Council's concerns about the missing ships and offered explanations that made no rational sense. They claimed the vessels hadn't been destroyed or captured. They had been relocated to more suitable dimensional frameworks. When Admiral Vorthke asked for clarification, Zeth Kaler continued, the humans demonstrated. The conference room had suddenly filled with the missing Council ships. Not holographic projections or sensor readings, but the actual vessels, complete with their crews, floating impossibly within the diplomatic chamber. The ship's crews appear to be going about their normal duties, unaware that they were now inside an alien structure light years from their last known positions. The crews couldn't see us, Zeth Kaler said. We were watching them through what appeared to be windows that opened onto their bridge compartments, but from their perspective, they were still traveling through normal space toward their original destinations. The human representatives explained that the Council ships hadn't been harmed or captured in any conventional sense. Instead, they had been archived, preserved in stable dimensional pockets where they could continue existing without interfering with local space-time. The crews would complete their missions, deliver their cargo, and return to port normally, never knowing they had been temporarily removed from baseline reality. It was supposed to be a humanitarian gesture, Zeth Kaler said. The humans claimed they were trying to prevent accidents. Council vessels were apparently wandering into areas of space that were becoming unstable due to human development projects, so they were being temporarily relocated for their own safety. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Development projects? That's what we asked, Zeth Kaler replied. The human representatives seemed genuinely surprised by our ignorance. They'd assumed the Council was aware of their basic engineering work. The sphere's walls had suddenly become transparent, revealing the space outside. What the diplomatic team saw there would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. The empty star system was anything but empty. It was filled with structures that operated on scales that challenged comprehension. They were building something, Zeth Kaler said. Not ships or stations, but something that encompassed the entire star system. Geometric patterns that extended for billions of kilometers, using the star itself as a component in some kind of massive machine. The humans explained that they were constructing what they called dimensional infrastructure, modifications to space-time itself that would allow for more efficient travel and communication across galactic distances. The work required careful manipulation of fundamental forces, which occasionally created fluctuations that could be dangerous to conventionally powered vessels. The missing Council ships had simply wandered into active construction zones, Zeth Kaler continued. The humans had archived them temporarily to prevent them from being damaged by the engineering work, planning to return them to normal space once the immediate projects were completed. Admiral Vorthke had asked the obvious question: why hadn't humans informed the Council about these construction projects? The answer revealed the true scope of human development and the naive assumptions that had guided Council policy. They had been sending reports, Kaler said. Detailed technical documentation, environmental impact studies, projected timelines. Everything had been transmitted to the Council through normal diplomatic channels. The problem was that the information had been encoded in mathematical frameworks that Council scientists couldn't interpret. The humans had assumed that any spacefaring civilization would naturally develop the mathematical tools necessary to understand dimensional engineering. When the Council failed to respond to their technical reports, humans had concluded that the projects weren't considered significant enough to warrant official acknowledgement. They showed us the reports, Kaler continued. Thousands of documents that our xenolinguistics teams had classified as untranslatable technical jargon. What we dismissed as meaningless mathematical gibberish were actually detailed construction plans for projects that spanned multiple star systems. The scope of human engineering work was staggering. They weren't just building in a three-dimensional space that other species understood. They were constructing across 11 different dimensional frameworks simultaneously. Their infrastructure included transportation networks that could move objects instantaneously across galactic distances, communication systems that operated outside normal space-time, and energy collection methods that drew power from the fundamental forces that held reality together. When Admiral Vorthicke asked about the military implications of this technology, Kaler said, the humans seemed confused by the question. They explained that they had no military applications for dimensional engineering. It was purely for civilian infrastructure development. But the demonstration that followed proved how naive that statement was. The human representatives had offered to show the diplomatic team a minor example of their transportation capabilities. The conference room had suddenly filled with water, not flooding, but existing in the same space as the air and furniture without displacing anything. We could breathe normally, Kaler said, but we were also swimming. The water wasn't in our dimension. It was occupying parallel space that had been temporarily aligned with our location. The humans explained that they could transport any substance to any location by temporarily synchronizing dimensional coordinates. Sarah's scientific training was warring with the impossibility of what she was hearing. That can't be possible. That's what our physicists said, Kaler replied. But we were experiencing it directly. The humans could move matter, energy, even abstract concepts like information or causality itself across dimensional boundaries. They weren't using faster-than-light travel. They were making distance itself irrelevant. The implications for warfare were obvious, even if the humans claimed not to recognize them. An enemy that could transport anything anywhere instantaneously could place weapons inside enemy ships, remove critical components from military installations, or relocate entire fleets without warning. The defensive applications were equally terrifying. How do you attack an enemy that can move their population and infrastructure into unreachable dimensions at will? Admiral Vorthicke requested a temporary recess to consult with his superiors, Kaler continued. The humans agreed politely and provided private quarters for the diplomatic team. That's when we realized we were trapped. The quarters were comfortable, even luxurious by Council standards. But when the team attempted to contact their fleet, they discovered that their communication equipment wasn't functioning. Not damaged or jammed, but operating perfectly while producing no results. They could transmit messages that showed all normal indicators of successful delivery, but received no responses. Lieutenant Kesshai attempted to use the emergency beacon, Kaler said. The device, activated normally, showed a strong signal, indicated that rescue ships were responding. But no ships ever came. We were sending distress signals into empty space that existed parallel to our location, but couldn't intersect with baseline reality. The diplomatic team was experiencing the same archival process that had been applied to the missing Council ships. They existed, they were functional, they could carry out their activities normally, but they were completely isolated from the universe they'd originated from. We spent 3 days trying to understand our situation, Zeth Kaler continued. The human representatives checked on us regularly, asking if we needed anything, offering additional comfort amenities, seeming genuinely concerned about our welfare. They appeared to have no understanding that we considered ourselves prisoners. On the fourth day, Admiral Vorthe K had demanded an explanation. The humans had seemed genuinely surprised by his distress, explaining that the diplomatic team's isolation was for their own protection. The dimensional construction work in the area was entering a high-intensity phase that could be dangerous to beings who weren't properly shielded. They offered to return us to our fleet immediately if we insisted, Zeth Kaler said. But they warned us that our ship would need to travel through an active construction zone, which might result in temporal displacement or dimensional fragmentation. The choice was simple: remain archived in comfortable isolation until the construction work was completed, or risk obliteration attempting to return to normal space. Admiral Vorthe K, trained in military protocol, had chosen the risk. The journey back to our fleet took 6 hours, Zeth Kaler said. During that time, we experienced things that our medical teams still can't explain. Time moved in circles, causality ran backward, and we existed in multiple states simultaneously. When we finally reached our ships, we discovered that 17 days had passed in normal space. The Grand Fleet's response to the diplomatic team's report was predictably catastrophic. Supreme Admiral Vorthe K's account of human capabilities was classified as extreme psychological trauma and dismissed by military leadership. The evidence was too far beyond known physics to be credible. But while command was debating the validity of our report, Zeth Kaler concluded long-range sensors detected something that made the entire debate irrelevant. He paused, his compound eyes focusing on something beyond the cantina walls. The humans were coming to meet us. The approach of the human fleet was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. They didn't travel through hyperspace or use any recognizable form of faster-than-light propulsion. Instead, they simply appeared, first as quantum fluctuations at the edge of sensor range, then as probability clouds that gradually solidified into physical vessels. Our sensors couldn't count them, Zeth Kaler said, his synthetic arm trembling slightly as he reached for his drink. Not because they were jamming our equipment, but because they existed in numerical states that changed depending on how you observe them. Sometimes we detected 10 ships, sometimes 10,000, sometimes a single vessel the size of a moon. Sarah had long since stopped taking notes. The scope of what she was hearing had moved beyond documentation into something that felt like witnessing the fundamental breakdown of everything she thought she understood about reality. What did the Fleet Command do? Supreme Admiral Vorthe K ordered defensive positions, Zeth Kaler replied. 5 million soldiers prepared for a battle that every tactical analysis suggested they couldn't win. But military protocol demanded that they try. The human fleet had arranged itself in a formation that defied spatial geometry. Their ships occupied positions that were simultaneously in front of, behind, and beside the Council forces. They existed in multiple locations without violating any physical laws, as if space itself was being reorganized to accommodate their tactical requirements. The humans opened communication channels before Admiral Vorthe K could demand their surrender, Zeth Kaler continued. But instead of speaking to command, they contacted every soldier in the fleet individually, addressing each being by name in their native language. The message had been identical across all 5 million recipients. We understand your concerns about our development projects. Please allow us to demonstrate that we pose no threat to your civilization. That's when the demonstration began, Zeth Kaler said. And that's when we finally understood what humans had become. The human ships hadn't attacked or threatened the Council fleet. Instead, they had performed what they called a capability exhibition, a systematic display of technologies that redefined the possible scope of warfare itself. They started with basic matter manipulation, Zeth Kaler said, taking asteroids from the local debris field and rebuilding them into perfect geometric shapes, not cutting or reshaping, but literally rewriting the atomic structure to create forms that couldn't exist naturally. The humans had then demonstrated energy manipulation on scales that challenged comprehension. They'd reached across space to touch the system's star, drawing streams of plasma into complex patterns that spelled out mathematical formulas in letters 1,000,000 kilometers tall. The plasma remained stable despite being separated from its source, forming words that could be read from the fleet's position. Next came their transportation technology, Zeth Kaler continued. They moved one of our own destroyers, a 700-meter warship with a crew of 3,000, from the fleet center to a position behind the human formation. Not with tractor beams or conventional propulsion, but by temporarily relocating the ship to a parallel dimension and returning it to normal space at the desired coordinates. The destroyer's crew had experienced the transportation as a brief moment of disorientation. 1 second they were in formation with the fleet, the next they were surrounded by human vessels. Their instruments showed no indication of movement. According to their sensors, space itself had rearranged around them. The humans returned the ship to its original position with a polite apology for the inconvenience, Zeth Kaler said. They explained that they were simply demonstrating the transportation methods they used for infrastructure development. Moving ships was more complicated than moving raw materials, but well within their basic capabilities. But the most terrifying demonstration was yet to come. The humans had offered to show the Council fleet what they called dimensional warfare, military applications that they claimed to have developed purely as theoretical exercises. Admiral Vorthicay should have refused, Zeth Kaler said. But military doctrine required that he assess the full scope of enemy capabilities. He authorized the demonstration, believing that understanding human military potential was worth the risk. The humans had selected a single Council frigate, the Stellar Unity, an older vessel with a crew of 200 volunteers who had agreed to participate in the test. What happened next challenged every assumption about the nature of combat itself. The human ships opened fire, Zeth Kaler said, but their weapons didn't target the frigate's hull or systems. They targeted the ship's existence itself. The weapons seemed to fire backwards through time, striking the frigate before they were actually discharged. The ship's armor began changing into different materials. Steel became wood, then crystal, then substances that had no names in any galactic language. The crew found themselves breathing water instead of air, but somehow remaining perfectly functional. The frigate started existing in multiple time periods simultaneously, Zeth Kaler continued. We could see it as it was during the battle, as it had been during construction decades earlier, and as it would be after centuries of decay. All three states occupied the same space without interfering with each other. But the most disturbing aspect was the effect on the crew. They remained conscious and functional throughout the transformation, experiencing their ship's multiple states of existence without losing their sanity or their ability to perform their duties. Captain Tetris Thiel reported that his crew was operating the ship normally in all three time periods simultaneously, Zeth Kaler said. They were fighting the current battle, conducting training exercises from the past, and performing maintenance routines from a future that hadn't happened yet. All at the same time, all equally real. The humans had, then, demonstrated defensive applications of dimensional warfare. They'd made the frigate completely invulnerable to conventional weapons by shifting its molecular structure into a quantum superposition. Plasma bolts passed through it harmlessly. Kinetic projectiles rebounded without impact. Energy beams were absorbed and redirected into parallel dimensions. The frigate became effectively immortal, Zeth Kaler said. Not heavily armored or well-shielded, but existing in a state where damage was conceptually impossible. The humans explained that this was a basic defensive measure they used to protect their civilian infrastructure during construction work. Sarah found her voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. How do you fight something like that? You don't, Zeth Kaler replied simply. That was the point of the demonstration. The humans weren't showing us their weapons. They were showing us that the very concept of warfare had become obsolete in their presence. The capability exhibition had continued for 6 hours, with the humans demonstrating applications of their technology that redefined every aspect of military strategy. They could make their ships intangible while keeping their weapons solid. They could fire projectiles that traveled through alternate dimensions to strike targets from impossible angles. They could create temporary black holes that only affected enemy vessels while leaving friendly forces untouched. But the final demonstration was the one that broke us, Zethkaler said. The humans offered to show us what they called consciousness warfare, the ability to target an enemy's thoughts and perceptions directly. Admiral Vorthake had hesitated before authorizing this test. The implications were obvious. Any species that could manipulate consciousness directly would have access to perfect intelligence gathering, absolute interrogation techniques, and the ability to control enemy actions without their awareness. They selected me as the test subject, Zethkaler said. I volunteered because I thought my military training would allow me to resist whatever they planned to do. The experience that followed couldn't be described in any language that relied on linear time or consistent causality. The humans hadn't attacked his mind directly. They had simply provided him with access to their perspective on reality. For 17 minutes, I saw the universe the way humans see it, Zethkaler said. Not just the physical dimensions we normally perceive, but all 11-dimensional frameworks simultaneously. I could see the past and future as clearly as the present. I could perceive the thoughts of every being in the fleet, the quantum states of every particle in local space, the probability clouds that surrounded every possible action. The experience had been overwhelming beyond description. Zethkaler found himself understanding technologies that a species wouldn't develop for millions of years, seeing tactical possibilities that encompass strategies spanning geological timescales, perceiving the motivations and fears of enemy commanders as clearly as if they were his own thoughts. When they restored my normal perception, he said, I understood why the humans seemed so confused by our military preparations. From their perspective, our entire fleet was as predictable as a clockwork mechanism. They could see every decision we would make, every tactical adjustment we would attempt, every possible outcome of any engagement we might initiate. The demonstration ended with the humans returning the test frigate to its normal state and apologizing for any discomfort caused during the exhibition. They explained that they had shown the Council fleet these capabilities not as threats, but as explanations for why traditional diplomatic and military protocols were no longer applicable to human interactions. They weren't trying to intimidate us, Zethkaler said. They were trying to help us understand that they had evolved beyond the need for conflict. From their perspective, war was simply a problem that less developed species hadn't learned to solve yet. The fleet's response was swift and predictable. Admiral Vorthake ordered an immediate withdrawal from human space, transmitted a formal report to the Galactic Council recommending immediate cessation of all contact with human colonies, and submitted his resignation from active military service. The withdrawal took 3 days, Zethkaler said. During that time, human ships escorted us to the edge of their territory, providing navigation assistance and offering supplies for the journey home. They were unfailingly polite, genuinely helpful, and completely oblivious to the terror they had inspired. The return journey to Council space was conducted in complete silence. 5 million soldiers who had witnessed the demonstration of human capabilities sat in their ships, trying to process what they had seen. Many would never fully recover from the experience. The official report classified the human encounter as first contact with post-singular species, Zethkaler said. The Council implemented a permanent quarantine around all human systems and established protocols for avoiding contact with any species showing signs of similar technological development. Sarah finally found the strength to ask the question that had been building throughout the entire conversation. What happened after that? Where are the humans now? Zethkaler's compound eyes focused on her with what might have been pity. That's the question, isn't it? 20 years have passed since the quarantine was established. Council ships have maintained their distance, monitoring human space from safe ranges, watching for any signs of expansion beyond their designated territory. He paused to finish his drink, his synthetic arm moving with mechanical precision. 3 years ago, the monitoring stations detected something that the council leadership has classified above my security clearance, he said. But the rumors among veterans suggest that human space is empty. Not abandoned, not destroyed, just empty. Their star systems show no signs of technological activity, no energy signatures, no indication that anyone lives there anymore. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cantina's temperature. Where did they go? Nobody knows, Seth Kaler replied. Maybe they transcended physical existence entirely. Maybe they moved to dimensions we can't perceive. Maybe they're still there, but existing in ways we can't detect. Or maybe, he trailed off, his voice carrying implications too terrifying to voice directly. Maybe what? Maybe they're everywhere now, he said quietly. Maybe the quarantine was never about keeping them contained. Maybe it was about keeping us from realizing that they're already here, watching us, studying us, waiting for us to evolve enough to have a conversation with them again. The old veteran stood slowly, his synthetic limbs whirring softly as they adjusted to support his weight. That's what I know about the human wars. That's what I've lived with for 20 years. And that's why I drink alone in cantinas at the edge of civilized space, trying to forget what I've seen. He looked down at Sarah one final time. You wanted to know the truth about those conflicts. Now you do. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Seth Kaler limped toward the cantina's exit, leaving Sarah alone with her silent recording device and the terrible weight of understanding. Outside, stars shone in patterns that suddenly seemed less random than they had before, as if they were arranged according to some vast design that only now was beginning to reveal itself. She sat in the empty booth for hours, staring at the recording device that contained the most important story in galactic history, and the one story that could never be published without destroying the fragile piece that kept civilization functioning. In the end, Sarah Chun would file a report about agricultural developments in Outer Rim colonies and destroy the recording of her conversation with Seth Kaler. Some truths, she realized, were too dangerous for the galaxy to know. But late at night, when she looked up at the stars, she found herself wondering if somewhere in the darkness, patient and incomprehensibly advanced beings were watching, waiting for the rest of galactic civilization to grow up enough to join them in whatever they had become. And sometimes in the deepest hours of the night, she could swear she felt them watching back.